During the early to mid-1900s, segregation grew across the U.S. Along with segregation, tensions between races grew rapidly, encouraging violence and hate acts. During these dark times, a handful of leaders stood up for what they believed in and paved the way for civil rights and equality. Many groups and organizations began to form and spread awareness of new movements. One of these movements is the Black Power movement of the 1960s. The Black Power movement gave credit to many civil rights leaders, including Malcolm X. Malcolm created a new philosophy for the people of color during the civil rights movement. He believed the right to fight back is a God-given right to all. Many people listened and agreed with his words and empowered the African American community. Even after his death in 1965, his beliefs continued to be followed by many smaller third parties. A new uproar began and created the Black Power movement. Therefore, we arrive at the question, what was Malcolm X's influence in the Black Power movement?
The Black Power movement helped to raise awareness about injustices that African Americans faced in America at the time. The following sources are used to provide specific information about how Malcolm X and his movement helped to raise awareness about these injustices. The selected sources identify specific events and traits that Malcolm X and how they benefited his movement. Written sources are very good for providing information and helping readers to understand what specific events may have been like at the time. The Black Power movement and Malcolm X's influence helped to raise awareness about the ongoing plight African Americans face. These selected sources describe what the movement may have been like at the time. Malcolm X and the revival of black nationalism. This article mainly discusses about Malcolm X's history being a black nationalist. Throughout this writing piece, the author also discusses about Malcolm's history and trying to promote special tactics on achieving equality for the African American community. To the opposing side, popular opinion claims, Malcolm used violent tactics that specifically targeted the white man. Malcolm X demanded racial and ethnic equality for his people and for future generations. Further expanding this idea of making future impacts, the author mentions in this article how, and this is a quote, Malcolm's take no prisoners approach to racial crisis appeals to young blacks disaffected from white society and alienated from older black generations. End quote. Modern opinion and interpretation of Malcolm's impact on racial equality has been under speculation and how Black Lives Matter operated. To this day, the African American community still protests about their oppression and struggle and try to get racial equality with the neighboring communities and the police by using some of Malcolm's beliefs and ideas. Comparisons are made today with the 60s to show that the fight Malcolm X fought is still being fought today. For example, the Black Lives Matter protests and police brutality trials. Interest in these issues are emerging from the racial discrimination as illustrated in this quote. Gusts of racial pride sweep across Black America as scholars retrieve the lost treasures of an unjustly degraded African past. Malcolm X's influence on the African American community during his time of power uprooted the dream of a dominant African American superiority. After his death, the dreams and ambitions started to become reality. The Black nationalist movement was started with the rise of the Black Panther Party a year after Malcolm's assassination. The coincidence can be depicted between the close relationship between Malcolm's death and the start of a Black nationalist party. Malcolm gave birth to the Black Power movement in the beginning and today, with Black Lives Matter having similar tactics and slogans from their idol leader, Malcolm X.
Black Power, International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. This article portrays how the assassination of Malcolm X impacted the Black Power movement of the 1960s. Martin Luther King Jr. was very famous during this time period for his nonviolent form of protest, whereas Malcolm X was viewed as violent and ruthless. Many people were against Malcolm due to these quick judgments of his character. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. Many young people of this time after the assassination felt that they were obligated to try and continue his work. Malcolm often used harsh words when publicly speaking, as he wanted to appear as strong and get his point across. This speaking tactic was strictly followed by large numbers of youth. For example, the article states, Malcolm had argued that the nonviolent tactics of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were not a viable option for Black people. Many people took this quote very far and began to attack Malcolm, claiming he was violent and unjust as a leader for civil rights. Organizations quickly formed, and the youth who believed so strongly in Malcolm would soon be the leaders of the Black Power movement.
The Encyclopedia of Third Parties in America by Deli Caprini. This article from the Encyclopedia of Third Parties in America was written to explain the start of the Black Panther movement. In the beginning of the article, the author explains how the party came about. Essentially, in 1966 was a life changer. Riot numbers were rising, anti-war movement became popular, and politics began to unravel. Malcolm X's part of this movement was after his assassination. It caused some sort of domino effect on the colored societies. One of the main beliefs in the party was Malcolm X's right for self-defense. The Panthers started patrols and neighborhood watches that consisted of members of the party holding large weapons clear as day to protect the citizens from being attacked by the police. The patrols made the poor communities seem more safe during the time from the police and violent protesters. This article is great for relating Malcolm's actions, which essentially created a whole other movement. The saying, "by any means necessary," came about by Malcolm X's famous speech. This was the moment the colored Americans began to fight back. Malcolm X believed that everyone was given the right to self-defense, whether violent or not. 1 year after his assassination, small parties in the U.S. began to rise up, and a new one was formed called the Black Panther Party. The party practiced self-defense in small, impoverished communities around the country. They also followed many of Malcolm X's beliefs on winning equality for oppressed minorities. Now, in today's society, we need to bring back the feeling of equality to all races. Here we interviewed a few students from the University of Kentucky campus. When you listen, you can hear the surprising lack of knowledge about Malcolm's influence on the Black Power movement and other protests he's had part in.
Topics related to Malcolm X and his contribution. First off, I have, what is your experience with learning about Malcolm X and his influences?
Little experience. I don't have much other than pretty much what's on biography.com.
Did they ever talk about it in middle school, high school?
Yes, he was talked about, vaguely talked about. Mostly it was about, MLK. Otherwise, not much was said.
Yeah, so it was mostly about MLK, nothing about Malcolm X.
Yeah.
My next question is, what do you think the Black Power consisted of, their viewpoints and their attitudes? Just anything that you've heard of, like, specifically, back in the 60s, when they were started?
Mostly from, and this is so relating to Malcolm X.
Yes.
Most of what I've heard is that basically the ideology was if you're being treated with violence, then the only way to stop the violence is to respond with violence back. But I do know that later he kind of changed a bit of his ideology before he died.
What if I told you the Black Power started after Malcolm X was assassinated? The Black Panther groups.
Then that's news, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So one last question I have: what do you know about the Black Power movement in the '60s compared to now, and how it relates to Black Lives Matter?
It's kind of similar to a little bit like what I said, but basically the purpose is that I know that definitely Charlottesville, right, when you had all the KKK show up, but then the Black Lives Matter showed up and they counter protested. I think that's a huge thing of what they're about, and it clearly seems to do something because shortly after the KKK was our next rally, it's not going to happen.
Here we have student B to talk about Malcolm X and his history and his contribution to the world we have today. What is your experience with learning about Malcolm X and his influences?
He was a human rights activist, and he just tried to make the world a better place for African Americans.
Did you ever learn about it in middle school or maybe high school? Did the teachers ever talk about it?
I didn't know. I didn't hear anything until I got to college.
Would you agree that it was more about MLK than Malcolm X? It was more about MLK's contributions?
Yeah.
What do you know about the Black Power movement in the 60s compared to now and how it relates to Black Lives Matter?
Pretty much the same with Black Panthers. They were all about the protesting and the nonviolent protest or ways of doing things. Now it's the same thing because it's easier to probably not easier to get shot or whatever. But it's saying either way you're going to get harmed for being a minority.
What do you think the Black Power consisted of, their viewpoints and attitudes? So the Black Power, this is the Black Panther Party that was started after Malcolm X was assassinated. What do you think, or if you know, was their viewpoints and what they really stood for?
They stood for equality and not being seen as just black people. Well, at first they wanted equal rights, but I think it evolved to something more as revenge. But I know their viewpoints were just because we're black doesn't mean we have to be treated equally. So we need the world to see that we're not harmful as they try to make us out to be.
History is not only expressed through records and documents, but can also be captured in photographs. The 3 images selected best embody our topic question about Malcolm X and his impact on the Black Power movement. The selected images depict the public display and influence the Black Power movement possessed. These images are associated with our research topic because they show how the Black Power movement was conducted and how it was led. The Black Power movement drew attention to African American communities' ongoing plight. These images help to capture the movement's nature and what it may have looked like at the time. The image displayed above depicts 2 Black American Olympic runners. The runners are shown wearing the United States Olympic track uniform and their medals that they had just won. Both athletes can also be seen raising a fist in recognition of the Black Power movement occurring simultaneously to the Olympics. The athletes are also shown wearing black gloves and bowing their head out of honor and respect for their cause. This public display of support also took place in a stadium containing thousands of people, which most likely led to many different opinions being formed. The image above represents the beginning of the international growth and recognition of the Black Power movement. During the 1986 Olympics, American runners Tommie Smith and John Carlos won both the gold and bronze medal in the 200-meter running event. While on the winner's podium receiving their medals, both athletes raised a fist in recognition of Black Power. Smith claims that his raised fist did not represent Black Power, but it was instead raised out of support for the All Lives Matter agenda. This public display of support for the Black Power movement drew national attention, and the photo itself has become an iconic photo that still has power today. The photo holds great significance because it symbolizes a time in which the movement drew global attention. The photo also symbolizes the courage it took for the two athletes to make such a controversial statement at the time in front of a global audience. By presenting their cause to a global audience, the Black Power movement gained support and recognition from across the globe. By bringing their cause to a global scale, both Tommie Smith and John Carlos paved the way for the rest of the Black Power movement to gain recognition and media attention it desired. Malcolm X's influence played a role in this public display of support for the Black Power movement because Malcolm X was known as a famous proponent of the Black Power movement. A symbol the Black Power movement often used was the raised fist to signify their cause. Therefore, both Tommie Smith and John Carlos, by raising their fists, thus pledged their allegiance to the Black Power movement and the ideals that Malcolm X championed. The Black Panthers, pictured above, staged mass protests throughout the 1960s and 1970s, opposing police brutality. As seen in the image above, members of this organization would wear all black and dress in military-style uniforms. The image shows the Black Panthers staging a public protest and carrying flags with their logos on it. The protest taking place can be seen as being peaceful, which coincides with what the majority of the Black Panthers' protests were. The image conveys the perception that the Black Panthers were an organized, confident, and determined group. This can be seen by the uniformity shown by their apparel, marching formation, and posture. The organization can also be seen protesting in a public roadway. By doing this, the Black Panthers are forcing people to acknowledge what they are advocating for. The Black Panthers were a black nationalist organization that urged blacks throughout the United States to fight back against oppression. The organization was founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. The two founders cited Malcolm X and others as their motivation for founding the organization. The establishment of the Black Panthers organization signaled a new dawn in the push towards equality for blacks. The establishment of the Black Panthers showed the public that blacks could organize and unite to fight for the same cause. In the past, blacks were typically assumed to be a subordinate group in America. The Black Panthers transformed that previous assumption and caused people to view blacks differently. The new perception that was created was that blacks were bold, courageous, and did no longer just accept injustices that they faced daily. The newly developed perceptions relates to Malcolm X and his beliefs because Malcolm X was known for being bold just like the Black Panthers were. Malcolm X's impact on the Black Panthers was primarily that he encouraged the organization to publicly display their beliefs, and since they closely identified with it. In this image, Malcolm X is seen holding a newspaper with an article titled, "Our Freedom Can't Wait." He is seen at a podium addressing a crowd and talking about something in relation to the newspaper article. As seen in the photo, Malcolm often dressed very professional by wearing a coat and tie when conducting public speeches. The presence of a banner in the background suggests that this specific public address was tailored towards a specific subject or cause that the banner is advertising that cause. Malcolm's appearance contributed to his overall success as a lead advocate for the improvement of equality for blacks across America. His courage and charisma to speak his mind in front of thousands of people created a network of followers which contributed to the growth of the overall Black Power movement. Malcolm X is one of the leading forces in inspiring the Black Power movement and encouraging blacks to fight back against the injustices that they faced. Malcolm X championed the phrase, "by any means necessary," describing the type of resistance he encouraged blacks to display. Despite his support and acknowledgement of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s peaceful, non-aggressive approach to protesting, Malcolm X still encouraged his supporters to work for equality by using the by any means necessary approach. Malcolm X was also known for his brash and charismatic personality. His rhetoric was often compared to that of Martin Luther King Jr.'s at the time. Dr. King's rhetoric was known for being well thought out and intellectual in nature, while Malcolm's rhetoric was more brash and unfiltered. In the image above, Malcolm X is holding a newspaper article depicting a common belief held by many blacks at the time, stating how they no longer wanted to wait for racial equality and instead wanted it now.
Although Malcolm X did not technically establish the Black Power movement, he had a significant effect on its development. Malcolm X served the role as the vocal advocate that the movement needed. Organizations such as the Black Panthers served the role of carrying out and displaying what the Black Panther movement believed in. They staged public protests and were able to gain support of famous black athletes such as Tommie Smith and John Carlos, who helped bring the Black Power movement to a global scale at the 1986 Olympics. Through leaders such as Malcolm X and other famous public figures, the Black Power movement was able to bring attention to the plights that blacks face every day in America and also begin to bring about change towards those plights.